The man who wrote it down had seen cavalry drill on 3 continents. He had watched the mounted Cossacks of the Russian steppe perform their war dances. He had studied Arab horsemen in the deserts of North Africa. His name was George Catlin, painter, traveler, one of the keenest observers the 19th century produced, and in the summer of 1834, riding with a column of United States dragoons through Indian territory, he watched a Comanche boy demonstrate something on horseback that stopped him cold. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The boy was moving at a full gallop. And then, between one stride and the next, he was gone. Not thrown gone. He had dropped his entire body to the side of the horse, one heel hooking over the animal's back, one arm looped through a braided sling of buffalo hide woven into the mane. The boy was horizontal, invisible, hidden behind the running body of the horse as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. And from that position, moving as fast as a horse can move across the southern plains, the boy raised his bow and sent an arrow flying. Catlin wrote later that this was the most astonishing thing he had ever seen or expected to see in his life. He was not a man given to exaggeration. What he had witnessed was not a trick. It was not a performance. It was a skill learned through years of daily practice, taught to every young man in the tribe, understood by the Comanche to be as fundamental to survival as breathing. It was the visible result of something that had been building on the southern plains for over a century, a transformation so complete, so thorough, that it had produced a new kind of human being. This is the story of how that happened. And it begins, as most great stories on the southern plains begin, with the horse. Before the horse, there were no lords of the plains. There were only people trying to live. The people who would become the Comanche were not, at the start of the 17th century, a people of the open grassland. They were a Shoshonean-speaking group of the Rocky Mountain foothills and the Great Basin, somewhere in the country we now call southern Wyoming and northern Colorado. Scholars describe them as small band hunters, mobile on foot, following the seasonal movements of deer and antelope, and occasionally the great bison herds that drifted through the lower mountain passes. They had no horses. The distance they could travel in a day was the distance their legs could carry them. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas with Cortés in 1519. For nearly 2 centuries, the colonial administration in New Mexico carefully controlled who could own and ride them. Horses were instruments of power, and the Spanish intended to keep that power for themselves. Then, in 1680, the Pueblo people of New Mexico rose up in one of the most successful native revolts in North American history. The Spanish fled south to El Paso. The corrals they left behind broke open. Horses moved north across the plains through a network of intertribal trade and raid that the Spanish could neither stop nor slow. The grasslands were about to change hands. The people who became the Comanche came south sometime around the turn of the 18th century. Historians have debated the precise timing and the exact route, but the Shoshone oral record preserved an account that the people who would become known as Comanche left their kin and went south in search of game and horses. They found both. And what happened next was, by any honest measure, one of the most remarkable cultural transformations in the history of North America. They were among the earliest of the Plains tribes to acquire horses in quantity. And unlike most groups who obtained horses and used them primarily as pack animals or as a means of faster travel on foot, the Comanche remade themselves entirely around the animal. Historian Pekka Hämäläinen, in his landmark study of this period, describes the transformation in terms of speed. With the horse, the world became smaller and its resources more accessible almost instantly. Within a generation, the Comanche had moved from marginal highland hunters to something the plains had never seen before. By the early 1700s, they had pushed the Apache, a formidable and well-established power, off the southern plains. The Apache had held that country for generations and were not a people who yielded easily. They had their own history of raiding, their own mounted warriors, their own deep knowledge of the terrain. The Spanish colonial records described the Apache as the most feared fighters on the southern plains in the late 17th century. Within a few decades of sustained Comanche pressure, the Apache were gone from Comancheria, pushed south and west into the desert country along the Rio Grande and beyond, into the broken mountains of what would become New Mexico and Arizona. The speed of that displacement suggests something about the qualitative difference in mounted capability between the two peoples during that period. Not that the Apache were weak, but that the Comanche were categorically better at the particular kind of warfare the open grassland required. The mechanism of that dominance was not simply aggression. The Comanche raided, but so did nearly every group on the plains. What distinguished the Comanche was the combination of speed, endurance, and precision that their horsemanship made possible. A Comanche raiding party could cover ground that no foot mobile or lightly mounted force could match, strike at a time and place of their choosing, and disappear before an organized response could be mounted. Spanish military expeditions sent to punish Comanche raiders consistently arrived at empty campsites. The bands had moved. The horses had carried them beyond reach. They had established trade relationships that stretched from the Rocky Mountain front to the Gulf Coast. They controlled a territory of roughly 240,000 square miles that came to be known as Comancheria, and they defended it against the Spanish Empire, the French colonial interest, and eventually the Republic of Texas and the United States Army, with a military effectiveness that confounded every opponent they faced. The Spanish tried diplomacy. They tried punitive expeditions. They tried building presidios, fortified outposts along the edges of Comancheria to contain the raiding. None of it worked for long, because containment requires a fixed line to hold, and the Comanche were not a fixed people. Their entire way of life was organized around movement. The horse that gave them military power also gave them the option of simply not being where the Spanish expected them. Governors of New Mexico and Texas wrote despairing letters to Mexico City describing what they faced. The Comanche, one official reported, could appear from any direction, strike with complete surprise, and be 40 miles away before a mounted response could be organized. That was not an exaggeration. It was an accurate description of what mobile, trained cavalry could do against a sedentary defense. None of that happened by accident. It happened because of what they did with the horse. And it started with the children. A Comanche boy received his first pony when he was around 4 or 5 years old. Not as a toy, not as a companion animal to be admired from a safe distance. As a responsibility. The pony was his, to feed and water and groom, to understand and read and learn. The relationship between that boy and that pony was the foundation of everything that would come later. Consider what that meant in practice. This was not a child who was occasionally lifted onto a horse for a supervised ride and then returned to other activities. This was a child who woke to the smell of horses, who spent the first hours of his morning in the animal's company before the band had broken camp, who knew his pony's moods and gaits and tolerances the way another child might know the sounds of his mother's voice. The pony learned the boy at the same pace the boy learned the pony. There was no separation. The instruction was not formal in the way outsiders would recognize no classroom, no assigned lesson, no teacher standing over the pupil. It was the transmission of knowledge through daily proximity, the older generation present and watching, correcting with a word or a gesture, and then letting the child work out the rest through repetition. The whole band moved on horseback. When a rancheria broke camp and relocated, which happened regularly, following the bison, following the grass and water that the horses required, the entire community was in motion. The lodges taken down and loaded onto travois, the children mounted, the horse herds moving around and through the column. Infants traveled on their mothers' backs or in cradleboards secured to the saddle. Children who could ride, rode. There was no such thing as a Comanche encampment in which the horses were a distant feature of adult life that children observed from the edge. The horse was the constant medium of daily existence, as present and unremarkable to a Comanche child as the ground underfoot. The training began with simple things. A boy would ride his pony at a walk, then a trot, leaning out to pick up small objects from the ground: a stone, a piece of wood, a bundle of grass. Then at a faster trot, then at a canter, then at a gallop. The objects got heavier as the boy got older and stronger. By the time a young warrior was considered competent, he could reach down from the back of a running horse and lift a grown man from the ground. This was not demonstration. This was preparation for battle, for the moment when a companion falls, and the only chance of saving him rides on whether another man can pull him up without slowing. Boys drilled with their horses every single day. Not occasionally. Every day. The Comanche understood something about the development of skill that military academies in the East were still trying to codify into doctrine. That genuine mastery, the kind that holds under pressure, requires repetition so complete that the action becomes reflex, divorced from conscious thought. A soldier who has to think about how to reload is slower than a soldier who does not think about it at all. A rider who has to consider his balance is already behind the rider who has forgotten that balance requires consideration. At around 5 or 6 years old, a boy received something else alongside his pony, a small bow and a quiver of arrows. The two forms of training were never separate. Learning to ride and learning to shoot were a single discipline, because on the southern plains they served a single purpose. A boy who could ride but not shoot was incomplete. A boy who could shoot but not ride was useless. The Comanche built warriors the way a craftsman builds a tool, every element integral to the whole, every part shaped to work in combination with every other part. The bow used by Comanche warriors in combat and on the hunt was a short, powerful composite weapon built for horseback. It was not the long bow of popular imagination. It was compact, typically under 3 feet in length, constructed from layers of sinew and wood laminated together under tension. It was drawn not to the cheek but to the chest, a technique that shortened the draw but increased the speed of release and suited the close-range work of running alongside a bison or closing fast on an enemy. A skilled warrior could loose an arrow every 3 to 5 seconds, keeping several in motion at once by holding spare shafts between his fingers as he drew. In the time it took a soldier with a flintlock musket to fire 1 round and reload, a process that could take a full minute under field conditions, a Comanche warrior on horseback could send somewhere between 10 and 20 arrows into the target. This was not a marginal advantage. This was the difference between an adequate fighting force and a force that operated in a different category entirely. The Texas Rangers, who learned this lesson the hard way through decades of painful engagement on the frontier, eventually sought out the Colt Patterson revolver specifically because it gave a mounted man multiple shots without reloading. Captain John Coffee Hayes understood the problem precisely. His Rangers, armed with single-shot rifles and single-shot pistols, had been fighting men who never needed to stop. The revolver did not match the Comanche rate of fire. It closed the gap enough to matter. But the bow was not the whole story. The bow worked because of the horse. The horse worked because of the training. The training worked because of the system that the Comanche had built around it, a system that shaped not just the warriors but the entire community. In Comanche society, horses were the measure of everything. A man's wealth and social standing were calculated in horses. The size of a man's herd determined his position in the band, his ability to provide for his family, his eligibility as a husband, his standing in council. A rancheria, a Comanche community of roughly 250 people, would typically maintain around 1,000 horses and mules. That is 4 animals for every person, a ratio that meant the grassland itself had to be a consideration in every decision about where to camp and how long to stay. By the mid-18th century, the Comanche held horse herds estimated at 30,000 animals or more. They were not only riders and raiders. They were breeders, with a sophisticated understanding of how to develop animals for specific purposes. The National Park Service documentation on this period notes that the Comanche became arguably the most equestrian-centric culture in the world. That is a claim that includes the Mongols, the Cossacks, the Bedouin Arabs. It holds up under scrutiny. The horse economy also made the Comanche the central node of a trade network that stretched across the southern plains and deep into Mexico. They traded horses north and south. They traded bison hides and dried meat for manufactured goods, metal tools, blankets, guns, and ammunition from Anglo-American traders entering Texas. They raided the ranches and settlements of Spanish New Mexico and Texas for livestock, which fed their herds and their trade simultaneously. Spanish officials found the Comanches' alternating strategies of trading and raiding deeply confusing because they assumed that trade partners and raiders were different categories of people. The Comanche understood them as tools applied situationally, each appropriate to its moment. This is what outsiders misread, consistently and almost without exception. When white observers encountered Comanche horsemen, soldiers, traders, Texas Rangers, surveyors, buffalo hunters, they almost universally reached for the language of the supernatural. They wrote that the riding seemed impossible, that no one should be able to do what these men were doing, that it defied what they thought they knew about the relationship between a human body and a moving animal. George Catlin, who spent years among dozens of native nations, and was not easily impressed, wrote that a Comanche on horseback became a different being entirely. He wrote that the man's face even became handsome when he laid his hands on his horse. William Blakemore, an Englishman who spent 8 years living among the Comanche and left one of the most observant accounts of daily life in Comancheria, described what he saw in terms that sound like mythology but were intended as plain reporting. On foot, he wrote, they are slow and awkward. On horseback, they are the most expert and daring riders in the world. What these men were witnessing was not supernatural. It was the product of 15 or 20 years of daily practice, begun in early childhood, built into the body so thoroughly that it was no longer a skill in the ordinary sense. It was identity. It was self. But there is something the popular imagination has almost completely misunderstood about the Comanche and their horses, and it is worth slowing down to address it before we go further. The Hollywood version of the Comanche warrior is a man of speed and fury, a force of nature rather than a thinking human being, wild rather than trained, instinctive rather than methodical. That version is wrong in almost every particular. It was also, not coincidentally, a version actively useful to the people who were trying to dispossess the Comanche of Comancheria. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Comanche system of horsemanship was deliberate, inherited, and precise. It was not the product of some vague natural affinity between plains people and horses, as if the horse were simply native to a particular kind of human being. The Comanche had been foot hunters within living memory when they acquired the horse. They had learned horsemanship. They had built it, taught it, refined it over generations, and passed it down with the same intentionality that any culture passes down its most important knowledge. The war pony was not the same animal as the hunting pony. The Comanche were expert horse breeders and trainers who selectively developed animals for specific functions. A war horse needed speed over short distances, courage under noise and chaos, and an absolute trust in its rider's commands delivered without reins, because a warrior fighting from horseback needed both hands free for his weapons. A hunting horse needed endurance, the ability to run alongside a bison for an extended chase without losing pace, and the specific trained knowledge of when to close on the animal and when to give way. The bison hunt itself was a study in organized, collective precision. A hunting party would surround a herd and force it into a compact mass, the animals bunching in confusion, slowing their run. Then the hunters closed in at full gallop, directing their horses with knee pressure and weight shift alone, selecting individual animals from the moving mass, driving their arrows in behind the last rib to reach the heart and lungs. Hamalainen describes hunts in which a group of Comanche hunters could bring down 200 or 300 bison in a single chase lasting less than an hour. That is not wildness. That is disciplined, rehearsed, communally coordinated work at full speed. The braided sling woven into the mane of a war pony, the loop that Catlin described, that allowed a warrior to hang horizontal at a full gallop, was not something improvised in the heat of battle. It was equipment, made and maintained with care, attached to an animal that had been specifically trained to hold its course and its pace while a man vanished from its back. The horse had to know. The horse had to hold. The whole system depended on a bond between rider and animal so complete that commands given by the pressure of a single heel over the horse's back were understood and answered without hesitation. In battle, the technique became something more than individual skill. Observers who survived engagements with Comanche war parties described a formation that had no real equivalent in European cavalry doctrine. Wallace and Hobel, the scholars who produced one of the most detailed studies of Comanche life, described a wheeling formation in which a wedge-shaped mass of warriors morphed with precision into a huge ring moving with machine-like regularity around the enemy. As each warrior reached the point on the circle nearest the opposing line, he dropped into the sling, disappearing behind his horse, firing his arrows from beneath the animal's neck. By the time he had completed his pass and pulled himself back upright, the next warrior was already dropping into position. The circle gave the enemy a continuous stream of arrows arriving from moving targets that never presented a clean shot in return. It was, in the precise sense of the word, a system, one built through years of individual practice organized into collective action. James Wilson Nichols, A Texan who witnessed a Comanche war display in 1840 wrote down what he saw in terms that make Catlin's account look restrained. Scores of warriors, he wrote, moved back and forth in front of the opposing line, lying flat on the side of their horse with nothing visible but a foot or a hand, shooting their arrows from under the horse's neck, straightening up, wheeling, reversing, always keeping the horse's body between themselves and the enemy. Nichols was a frontiersman who had seen violence. He described the display as producing something close to awe. This is what the buffalo hunters encountered. In the 1870s, after the Civil War had ended and the hide market had opened and men with heavy sharps rifles had begun moving onto the southern plains in numbers, the professional hunters who worked the buffalo ranges of western Texas and Kansas found themselves operating in Comancheria. Some of them had served in the army. Some had fought in the war. They were, by any measure, hardened men who did not scare easily and did not admit to being impressed by much. They understood, in a general way, that the Comanche were dangerous. That knowledge was currency on the frontier, the kind of thing you absorbed before you rode out past the line of settlements. What they did not fully understand, most of them, was what dangerous looked like in its specific and human detail. They had heard stories. Soldiers had told them things. Other hunters had warned them. But there is a difference between knowing that a thing is formidable and standing on a patch of hardpan in the Texas Panhandle and watching it move. The southern plains in those years were in a transition that almost no one on either side fully grasped in the moment. The Comanche bands that still ranged freely were doing so on a landscape that was changing faster than any generation before them had seen. The buffalo were thinning visibly from one season to the next. The hunters' camp's rough collections of canvas and timber, stacked hides reeking in the summer heat, skinners working from first light, were pushing further into country that had been reliably Comanche not 5 years earlier. The army was mapping and patrolling with a persistence that the previous decade had not seen. The noose was drawing in, though neither the hide hunters nor the Comanche could have named the precise shape of it yet. It was in this charged and deteriorating country that men who had spent years learning to read landscape and weather and animal behavior watched a Comanche boy practice. The accounts that survive describe a particular kind of silence that fell over men who had talked freely about their own capabilities until they saw what a Comanche boy could do at full gallop. Not boy as diminutive a young warrior, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, who had been riding daily since before he could fully walk, whose body had been shaped by a decade of practice into something the hide hunters had no adequate comparison for. They had seen horse soldiers. They had seen trick riders in traveling shows. They had seen Apache horsemen and Kiowa warriors. None of it had prepared them for this. The Comanche understood the tactical value of shock not just in battle, but as a psychological instrument. A warrior who could disappear and reappear while his horse ran full speed, who could shoot accurately from a position that seemed to defy physics, who could turn in an instant and be gone before a muzzle-loaded rifle could be reloaded, and aimed. That warrior occupied a different category in the minds of his opponents than the category of mere fighting man. He was a problem for which the traditional solutions did not work. The buffalo hunters wrote about what they saw because they could not entirely account for it. One set of accounts describes watching a boy practicing at full gallop along a dry creek bed, swinging down to touch the ground with his hand on one side, pulling himself back up, crossing to the other side, down again, all without breaking stride. The men watching him had been shooting buffalo for years. They had considered themselves competent on horseback. What they were watching was so far past their own capability that they found themselves without language for it. There is a useful honesty in those accounts, even in their incomprehension. The hide hunters were, by and large, not generous in their assessments of the people whose land they were working to make uninhabitable. They competed with the Comanche for the same buffalo. They supplied a market that was, deliberately, intended to eliminate the animal that the Comanche economy depended on. Army officers were frank about this. Eliminate the buffalo, eliminate the Comanche. The hide hunters knew what they were part of, and yet they could not watch that boy ride and say it was nothing. They wrote it down because it was true, and because truth, even inconvenient truth, has a way of demanding to be recorded. What they were watching was the visible result of a culture that had built itself, over roughly a century and a half, around a single organizing principle, the horse and everything the horse made possible. The Comanche had taken something the Spanish brought to the Americas as an instrument of conquest and remade it, on their own terms, into the foundation of an empire that lasted longer than the Spanish hold on New Mexico. The boy riding at full gallop down that dry creek bed was not performing for the hunters who watched him. He was practicing. He was doing what he had done every day since he was old enough to own a pony. His grandfather had done the same. His grandfather's grandfather had been the generation that first learned, that first received the horse and understood what it meant. The skill was inherited. The muscle memory was trained. The bond between rider and animal was built of hundreds of hours that no outsider ever saw. The Comanche themselves, UU in their own language, the people, did not separate the horse from identity in the way that outside observers tried to. The horse was not a tool they picked up and put down. It was not equipment in the military sense, something issued and maintained and turned in at the end of service. The bond between a warrior and his war pony was understood by the Comanche to be a relationship of mutual trust and obligation that resembled, in its emotional weight, the most important human relationships. Blakemore reported that each warrior had a favorite war horse he regarded with great affection and mounted only when going into battle. The horse was kept tied near the teepee. The horse knew its owner's voice, its owner's smell, its owner's hands. Horses were also understood as spiritual in ways that outsiders rarely recorded accurately. In Comanche belief, the horse was not simply an animal that had proven useful. It was, according to those who have documented the oral traditions carefully, understood as something closer to a gift, a living being whose participation in the life of the band was not taken for granted. Before battle, a warrior painted his war horse with the same care and the same designs he used on his own body. The paint was not decoration. It was preparation, protection, and declaration simultaneously. The horse that went into battle was a partner going in, not a vehicle being driven. The distinction mattered to the Comanche even if it was invisible to the soldiers who opposed them. When the U.S. Army moved against the Comanche in the Red River War of 1874, the campaign that finally broke Comanche resistance on the southern plains, one of the most effective tactics was the destruction of the horse herds. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, in Palo Duro Canyon in the fall of 1874, ordered the capture of the Comanche horse herd and then had more than 1,000 horses shot. The Comanche survivors, their lodges burned, their winter supplies destroyed, now horseless on a landscape that had made no sense on foot for 3 generations, were left with nothing. They came into the reservation. The strategy had worked. The army understood, even if history sometimes forgets, that what they were destroying was not merely transportation. It was identity. It was the whole system that the boy at the dry creek bed had been practicing to join. Think about what that system had built. A people who arrived on the southern plains as obscure foot hunters had, within 4 generations, become the dominant military and economic power across 250,000 square miles. They had held the Spanish Empire at bay for over a century. They had made the early Republic of Texas, at its founding, so precarious that survival was genuinely uncertain. They had driven the Apache from country the Apache had controlled for generations. Every one of those outcomes depended not on luck or geography alone, but on a trained human capacity that the Comanche had deliberately built and sustained across decades. The boy at the dry creek bed was not an exception. He was the rule. He was what the system reliably produced. After Palo Duro Canyon, the bands that came into the reservation at Fort Sill in Indian Territory found themselves in a world organized around their incapacity. The horses were gone. The buffalo were going, slaughtered in numbers that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier, from an estimated 30 million animals at mid-century down to near extinction by the early 1880s. The seasonal movement that had structured Comanche life, the mobility that the horse had made possible and that the buffalo had made necessary, was replaced by fixed boundaries and government rations that arrived on someone else's schedule. The knowledge did not disappear entirely. It could not be shot like a horse or burned like a lodge. It lived in the people who carried it in the hands, and the posture, and the instinct of men and women who had spent their childhoods learning things they could no longer practice. But the system that had transmitted that knowledge, the daily drilling, the pony given at age 4, the community expectation that every boy would ride, and every girl would ride, and the whole band would be horseback before the morning was half done, that system was broken. You cannot teach a child to pick up objects from the ground at a gallop if there is no horse, no ground to ride, no reason that anyone in authority will permit. The Comanche nation today numbers roughly 15,000 people. The spirit of the horse, as historians and tribal members have documented, remains part of the culture's living memory, not as nostalgia, but as a foundation. What the Spanish brought as a weapon of conquest, the Comanche took and made into something that sustained them for generations, that allowed them to build the most powerful native empire on the southern plains, that produced riders whose capabilities confounded every person who saw them with fresh eyes. The boy at the creek bed grew up if he lived through the Red River War, if he survived the reservation years, if the tuberculosis and the hunger and the violence of the confined years did not take him. If he had children, he tried to teach them what his father had taught him, what his grandfather had modeled, what the whole community had enforced through daily expectation. Not all of it survived. Much of it was deliberately destroyed. Boarding schools took children away from the people who could have taught them. The horses that made practice possible were gone. But the record survived. Catlin's letters, Blakemore's account, Nichols's description at the council house. The army reports that describe, with grudging precision, what their scouts and their soldiers had seen. The oral histories, the paintings that Catlin made in 1834 and 1835, now held in the Smithsonian, showing a young Comanche warrior hanging horizontal at full gallop, invisible behind his running horse. These records exist because what the Comanche built on the southern plains was real, and real things leave evidence. The hide hunters wrote it down because they could not convince themselves they had not seen it. The army destroyed the horse herds because they understood that the horses were the point. And the people survived. That is not a small thing, and it is easy to pass over quickly in a story that ends with military defeat and reservation confinement. The Comanche Nation exists. It has governed itself continuously from its headquarters in Lawton, Oklahoma. Its members have served in every American war since the late 19th century. The language, Comanche, has been taught and maintained by tribal members who understood that language is not merely communication, it is the structure through which a people's accumulated understanding of the world is preserved and transmitted. The same impulse that drove the Comanche to teach their children to ride before they could walk, the conviction that knowledge passed down is identity preserved, drove the language teachers and the cultural programs and the tribal historians who kept the record alive through the reservation decades and beyond. The horse itself came back, not as the foundation of an economy and a military system, because the world that made that possible was gone, but as ceremony, as culture, as a living thread between the present and the past. Comanche riders participate in powwows and cultural gatherings on horseback. The imagery of the horse runs through Comanche art and storytelling. Children learn to ride, not in the pre-dawn hours of a rancheria camp, not as preparation for battle, not with the daily grinding practice that produced warriors who could hang horizontal at a full gallop. But they learn. The connection persists. It is thinner than it was, reshaped by a century and a half of confinement and loss, but it is present. The hide hunters who watched that boy at the dry creek bed and fell silent, they were watching something near its peak. They did not know that. They thought, probably, that what they were seeing was simply the way these people were and always had been, not the product of a specific historical process that was, in those exact years of the 1870s, being dismantled. The boy they watched had been born into something that his children and grandchildren would not be born into. The system that had made him was ending around him while he practiced. What buffalo hunters said after watching a Comanche boy ride at full gallop was, by most accounts, very little. They said less than usual. The words were not adequate to what they had seen, and they knew it. And they wrote the truth of it later, when they had distance from the moment. They had thought they understood what a horse and rider could do together. They had been wrong. They had been watching the product of 150 years of accumulated knowledge, passed from parent to child, refined and sharpened with each generation, built on a foundation that began when the first Shoshone-speaking people came south out of the mountain country, looking for game, and found something that would change everything. They had been watching the people in the element they had made their own. Remember the names. Remember what they built. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.